Okay. All right, sorry about that. A little technical difficulties, but anyhow, we're back. So this is week 4, Life of Christ, winter trimester, year 11. We are in section 35. And section 35, I think, is an interesting section because we really have an opportunity to dive into some timeline here and some chronology as it relates to the life of Christ. And we're going to see a few things tonight that are interesting. So anyhow, the life of Christ, section 35, according to Fruchtenbaum, is entitled The Arrest of John the Baptist. So that's the section that we're going over. I'm going to retitle this The First Departure to Galilee. And we'll see why here in a moment. Well, throughout this class. Hopefully, this is how I had to look at things this week. And this is what I spent the majority of my time over the last couple of weeks, actually, looking at, trying to figure this out. But anyhow, so the traditional harmony, Fruchtenbaum is this, Pentecost is this, our notes is this is what we've all been taught. This is how most harmonies are going to arrange the life of Christ. And to be fair, Fruchtenbaum is coming from a thematic perspective. Now, it is chronological for the most part, but he does break things up thematically, and he says that he does. So I want to be fair here and say that that's what his intention is and sort of his presentation. But most harmonies are going to compress John 4 with Luke 4, with Matthew 4, with Mark 1. And all of these passages are talking about a departure to Galilee. Now, all these harmonies, they compress them into one single event. And so you have the temptation taking place in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Immediately following the temptation, you have the departure to Galilee. And we'll read this. And we've read it, and we've seen this. And so after the temptation in the synoptics, there's an immediate move to Galilee. And then you have John 4, verses 1 through 4. These traditional harmonies are going to say that this is the same departure, but this is a departure told from John's perspective. So one of the things that is always sort of been confusing to me in my head is we hear statements like, well, this is from so-and-so's perspective, but we got to remember they're not chronological. And I've stood up here and I've said that. And it's not as though John's not chronological. He's absolutely chronological. He's not saying that sign 6 happened before sign 1 happened. He's chronological according to his theme, but it may not be moment to moment to moment, but it is chronological. According to maybe his signs, and we'll see this in a moment, and hopefully this evening. So anyhow, maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Most harmonies are going to say that this John 4 is the same departure. That immediately follows the temptation account. So they assume that there's a single departure, and then John 5 in the traditional harmonies. Now, this may not be explicitly stated, but it is implied, because most of these harmonies are always going to assume that there's a 3 to 3.5 year ministry of Christ. We've all been taught this. This is what we know. Christ had a ministry of 3 to 3.5 years. Okay? But how do we date the ministry time of the life of Christ? How do we date how long his ministry was? By Passovers, okay? So there's 3 explicit Passovers. We know that there's 3 Passovers in the life of Christ. The 4th Passover is John 5. Not chronologically, but that's the feast in question that we'll see. If you're going to say that Christ had a 3 to 3.5 year ministry, you have to have this as being a 4th Passover. Okay, so this is the traditional way that we've all been taught. This is really the standard model. Now, it's not the only model, and it's not the only way to look at this. So, two departures, and I've got the passages up here so that we can see here. Let's read John 4, 1 through 4. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making, and really before I read this, do you all remember last week, section 34? The last section we went over was what? John's witness, John the Baptist's witness. John the Baptist is on the scene, witnessing and baptizing. So here we go. John 4, 1 through 4. This immediately follows this. Therefore, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went away again into Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. That's the John account. So here's the Matthew account, Matthew 4, verse 12. Now when Jesus heard that John had been taken into custody, he withdrew into Galilee. Here's the Mark account. Now, after John had been taken into custody, Jesus came into Galilee. And then finally Luke. And Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through all the surrounding district. And notice here that this account follows exactly on the heels of Christ's baptism. Or excuse me, this shouldn't say baptism. This should say temptation. This follows exactly on the heels of Christ's temptation, just like Matthew and Mark did. Additionally, it describes the beginning of a robust Galilean ministry. So we have great confidence that Luke here is talking about the same departure from Galilee, from Judea to Galilee that follows the temptation that Matthew and Mark are talking about. Yes?
So in John and Luke up there it says, returned and again into Galilee. So does that play anything into what you're saying?
Well, he's been to Galilee before this, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so you're talking about, all right.
Let's,
Well,
yeah.
I'll just let you keep talking.
Yeah,
Because I'm
yeah.
a little confused. I'm like, okay, how many times?
Exactly. Yep. There's a lot going on here. So same or different. In John 4, you see John is still baptizing. Verses 1 through 4. John's still baptizing. And I'll show you how we know that in a moment. The Pharisees notice these numbers coming up. There's a voluntary departure that takes place. There's no arrest in John 4. John the Baptist is not arrested. He's still baptizing. There's no persecution. This is early stage Judean ministry. Okay, note. This is immediately, like I said, following from John 3. This is a continuous narrative flow. John 2, John 3, John 4, John 5. There's no breaks here. This is a continuous flow. So this word is super important, and we see this in John 4, verse 1, the very first word, therefore. So in other words, because of these things is what John is saying. Because of what things? Because of what John has just recorded in chapter 3, verse 22 through 36, which was what? John the Baptist actively baptizing. And John stating that John has to decrease, Messiah has to increase. Because of this, because of what John the Apostle has just written, speaking about John the Baptist baptizing, because of this, Jesus has to leave. So Jesus left Judea and went to Galilee. Therefore, now we see it. John 3, 22 through 36, John the Baptist is actively baptizing. The ministry overlap with Jesus. He must increase and I must decrease. Jesus' popularity is beginning to grow. Jesus has been announced and all eyes are turning towards Christ. Therefore, because of these things, the Pharisees notice Christ's following is growing, attention is rising, and he leaves for Galilee. There's no mention of John's arrest. In fact, the reason Jesus leaves is explicitly stated by John. The reason that he leaves is stated by John because of what was going on with John the Baptist, with Jesus' overlapping ministry. He's beginning to gain some attention. He's starting to baptize more people than John the Baptist. Remember, John the Baptist's followers are like kind of jealous for John the Baptist, like, oh, you know. And he says, no, I must decrease, he must increase. Remember this language? Because of this, Jesus leaves and goes to Galilee. So what is the timeline marker that we know begins the Galilean ministry? What begins the Galilean ministry? It's the arrest of John the Baptist. That's what kicks off the Galilean ministry. And that's documented in those passages we just read. Mark documents it. Matthew documents it. Luke doesn't document necessarily the specific occasion, but he's documenting that when this happens, the robust Galilean ministry begins, which is consistent with Matthew and Mark. So, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All three of their accounts, John is arrested. Well, these accounts include all these events in total. Luke doesn't document John's arrest. But anyhow, these synoptics record John's arrest. This says after he is arrested, this ministry begins and the Galilean preaching tour starts. So does this sound like the same departure to you all? It sounds like two completely different things to me. Sounds like two departures. So I think two departures fit the text better. You have in the first departure, John 4. John is still active. And we know John's still active because it's following on John still being active in John 3. There's no break here. Therefore, because of these things, John 3, popularity is rising. There's a strategic withdrawal from Christ into Galilee. It makes me think of like the Lord's words when he says, my hour has not yet come. He's starting to gain some attention. And something that is also interesting about this to me is that when I'm reading through these passages, you get to see the subtle nuances of how significant little what I've always just kind of read over. Namely, in this scenario, John the Baptist. John the Baptist, I've said this before, is a big deal in the life of Christ. He's got major chronological timeline markers that we can look to as far as when the Lord was ministering. The second departure here in the synoptics, John is imprisoned. There's escalation in Judea. There's a public campaign in Galilee. This is a very robust, very public campaign going on in Galilee, going from town to town. The disciples are all being called in Galilee. There's no, well, we'll get to this. The kingdom proclamation begins in Galilee here. So these are different causes. There's different causes for these departures. There are different contexts. They're completely different contexts. One, John the Baptist is arrested. One, he's still ministering and baptizing. They're different departures. And I think that fits better here. So how I think these events actually read. You have the temptation in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is what I'm going to call the phase 1 authentication ministry of Christ. This is John only, pre-Galilean. Early Judean, Samaritan ministry, a little bit of Galilee in here, but not what we think about when we think about Christ going to Capernaum and setting up his main like headquarters kind of like place. So we have, in this phase 1, you have John 1, the first disciples. Andrew, John, Philip, and Nathanael are called. Peter has his encounter. Then you have Cana, this first sign of John. This is then following this, you have the first Passover. You have John 3 with Nicodemus and John the Baptist's witness. Following that, you have Christ leaving in his first departure, going up to Samaria. Then you have the official son is healed, sign number 2 that John records. Then you have John 5. There's this mystery feast that takes place in verse 1. We don't know what that is. Bethesda comes, the Lord returns to Jerusalem, heals the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, demonstrates he is Lord of the Sabbath here, as well as other places, but this is the third sign that John records. So John the Baptist is still active. Jesus is authenticating his identity. And there's no mention of any formal apostolic training in John 1 through 5. None. Zero. Every mention that is going on between John 1 through 5 is the Lord Jesus authenticating who he is. He is telling the nation who he is before he even starts any sort of formal discipleship training or apostleship. Jesus is confronting the leadership of Israel before he trains anyone. He is authenticating who he is. And this is John 5, and I wrote it there 3 times. John 5, John 5. This is an authentication, first phase ministry of Christ. Then the hinge event takes place. John the Baptist is arrested. Now, after his arrest, you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke picking up with a separate departure. This is the phase 2 Galilean campaign. This is where the synoptics begin. This is what starts the Galilean campaign, or not campaign, ministry, is John the Baptist's arrest. You have Matthew 4, 13 through 17, he moves to Capernaum as the headquarters. He's calling the disciples. These preaching tours begin. These miracles start happening. There's this kingdom proclamation. And then the Gospels rejoin at John 6. This is where all the Gospels meet back up. They all document the feeding of the 5,000, which is right on the heels of what? John the Baptist's death. This is what causes, or not causes necessarily, but this is the timing event that we can look to say this is when the feeding of the 5,000 happened. Right after John the Baptist's death. Right after Christ learns about his death.
Question.
So, yes.
So what are you suggesting the time frame is between his arrest and his death?
John the Baptist's arrest and death? I'm gonna say 10 months.
10 months?
10 months. Well, no, excuse me. No. I'm gonna say, yeah, about 10 months. Yep. And we'll get to this in a minute. I'll explain my rationale for this. So, notice how all these Gospels, when we start picking up a timeline like this, there's no, I'm not forcing anything here, okay? Each Gospel starts exactly where it claims to start. John records the Baptist's testimony, and this gets a little bit confusing. So if I say the Baptist, I'm talking about John the Baptist and John the Apostle, 2 different people here. But if there's confusion, please point it out to me so that I can clear it up, hopefully. But anyhow, John records the Baptist's testimony and the early signs he personally witnessed. Matthew, Mark, and Luke begin with the Galilean ministry after John's arrest. If John 4 happened during the synoptic timeline, why don't they record the Samaritan woman? Why don't they record the nobleman's son being healed? There's no record of the Bethesda healing in the synoptics. Why is that? And John 3 occurs before John's arrest and directly explains, like we spoke about, John 4's departure. Therefore, there's no need to force John 4 into the synoptic timeline. There's really no need for it. So the eyewitness problem here. John records 3 major events during John 4 and 5. And there's probably more than this, But these are the three big ones. Remember, John 4, he is gaining attention. The Pharisees see that he's baptizing more than John the Baptist. He leaves for Judea. He leaves from Judea to Galilee. I'm going to get myself all mixed up here. Passing through Samaria. No other gospel mentions this as they're beginning to the Galilean ministry, though he would have passed through Samaria, but this is specific to John. Why? Because there's the Samaritan woman at the well. Only John records this. The healing of the nobleman's son is the second sign. Only John records this. The healing of the lame man in Bethesda pool is the third sign. These are all recorded in John 4 and 5. Only John. According to the traditional timeline, these events occurred during the synoptic timeline. Okay? Does that make sense? Do you see what I mean by that? What I'm saying is, according to the traditional harmonies that we read, John 4 is included in and the beginning of the synoptic timelines of the Galilean ministry. Okay? Why is there no record of these events? Because they're not there. They're not there yet. These authors are not there yet. The synoptic authors do not witness these events. Peter, he's not called until Luke 5. This is well accepted. This is not fringe theology that I'm saying here. That Luke 5 is the calling of Peter. That's not a fringe statement. That's like very well accepted. However, you can't say Peter's called in Luke 5, but he's also called back in John 1. Remember when Christ comes back from his temptation? John the Baptist sees him. Behold, the Lamb of God. Points out to two of the disciples who are there, Andrew and John the Apostle, who are there. There's the Messiah. They go and follow him. Andrew goes and gets Peter. Jesus comes over to Peter and says, your name will be called Peter, or Cephas. There's no calling here. Then he finds Philip, follow me, goes in and sees Nathanael reading under the tree. Those four are following him. Peter is not. We can't say that this is Peter's call. It's very well accepted that Luke 5 is Peter's calling. Matthew, so Mark, who's Peter's companion here, documenting this, doesn't document what Peter doesn't witness. Peter's not present for Bethesda. Okay? He's not there. He doesn't see the Samaritan woman. Why doesn't he document it? Because he's not there. He's not a first-hand witness to this. Who is? John. John the Apostle is. Matthew's not there. He's not called until Matthew chapter 9. He doesn't see these things. He doesn't see the nobleman's son being healed in Cana after passing through Samaria. Jeez, I gotta. Luke relies on the apostolic witnesses here. Peter and Matthew are not present, so he does not record it. But John the Apostle was there. He had firsthand knowledge of every single one of these events. He is called early in John 1. He's present for Cana, the water to wine miracle. This is the first sign that John documents. John's there. He's present for the first temple cleansing, the first Passover that we read about, where the Lord comes down and cleanses the temple. John's there. Why don't the other synoptics document the temple cleansing here, the first temple cleansing?
When you say John, you're talking about the apostle.
Correct. John the Apostle. Yep.
Is there for all those.
Yep. Who was a disciple of John the Baptist. So this begs the question, and this is just my own thoughts. And really, I was talking to Sam about some of this too, and he brought this up. He goes, well, then why was Philip and Nathanael called early? Early called, John 1. And I think it's a great question. I don't know why. I don't have an answer. I can see why John was. He's there and he's documenting this. But anyhow.
Well, another question to go along with that one is, why didn't he call Peter when he met him?
This is what I think I have, theologically, I think it's significant. Because what it demonstrates is Peter's salvation story demonstrates that one is not saved by evidence. You're not going to prove somebody into this. Peter witnesses a lot of stuff. He sees his mother-in-law get healed by Christ before he's called. So, and that's Luke 4. So anyhow, we have in John, so John's there. He sees the Samaritan woman here at the well. He sees the nobleman's son being healed in Cana, back up in Cana after the first departure. He sees the healing of Bethesda, the third sign, which takes place in Jerusalem after this mystery feast of John 5:1. So John, and John alone, possesses unique knowledge of these events. He carefully preserved them for us. This perfectly explains the difference in timelines and why there are two departures. There have to be two departures here. John 4 and John 5. They read as a continuous chronological timeline. You cannot split John 4 from John 5. They're chronological. They're moving as a continuous timeline. The only time marker indicated here is a feast of the Jews, and this is in John chapter 5, verse 1. But this does not require a Passover. This can easily be understood as another feast. Here it seems to imply a feast requiring movement to Jerusalem. What are the three feasts that required you to go to Jerusalem? Pentecost, Tabernacles, and Passover. Those are the three feasts that you had to go back to Jerusalem for. But it doesn't even require that, the John 5:1. Turn to John 5:1 here. We'll see what, we should probably read the passage here that we're talking about. The passage in question. So this is right after the second sign, where he says that he healed the nobleman's son. And this is the second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. That's verse 54 of chapter 4. Then 5:1. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. This feast of the Jews is the feast in question. What feast is this? This is the feast that traditional timelines are going to say this is a Passover feast. And then they're going to say, because this is a Passover feast, we have 3.5 years. Yes.
And also, I got a note in my Bible that says some manuscripts say the feast, which would indicate that it is the Passover.
Okay.
That's some manuscripts say that. That doesn't mean, it
Yeah.
necessarily has to be the Passover.
Yeah.
That would be a rationale for why you would assume it's the Passover.
Yep. Sure.
He had already been to a Passover in John 2.
Yeah.
This is very soon after.
Very soon.
So,
You're talking between John 2, John 5, and John 6, you have 3 Passovers? That's a lot of Passovers. Well, it's 3. So anyways, but I do think that's a good point. I mean, that's a lot of time here. Some people have suggested this as Purim, which is a commemoration of Haman and Mordecai and Esther in that story, which is a feast of the Jews, but it doesn't require movement to Jerusalem. So, but I think what's interesting here is that there's really no seasons that are changing. There's no time markers, which John uses. He uses time markers. John says, the Passover of the Jews was near. He says things like this, and we're going to look at all of them here in a moment.
I think too, but, and I could be wrong, but it seemed like, they did have lots of feasts.
They had lots,
And
yeah.
I think when they have the ones that are required for them, that the scripture is a little more specific, right? Like,
Especially Passover, especially when John says it, which is the book that this question feast is in. So we'll see this. There's no mention of a pivotal time marker that would have been front and center. So John's arrest is absent. That's what's curious here too. John's arrest is absent. This is a big deal. John 4 and 5, in fact, John 5 cites Jesus as appealing to John the Baptist as a witness to himself in John 5. But notice the tone Jesus uses in John chapter 5. It is an active witness of John. And we'll go over these things. I'm just kind of setting the stage here. Obviously, we're going to go back and pick this up, but I'm trying to set up a big picture here that at least helps me see things. I don't know, maybe you guys have this all sorted, but I definitely didn't. And I'm not saying that I do totally have it all sorted now either, but I think this may be a better way for me to at least see this. Hopefully it helps. The tone when Christ is sending these people, or is talking to the Jews in Jerusalem, in John 5, about John the Baptist as being a witness to who he is, messianically. It's not, you arrested this witness of mine, John. It's not as though he's a past memory that took place a while ago or a year ago. It doesn't feel as though John is currently imprisoned in John 5 when the Lord is referring to him. Why does this matter? Remember, John 4 is assumed to be after the Baptist's arrest. So if John 4 is part of the same departure, it's just from John's perspective, the same departure to Galilee from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then that means, that necessitates that it is after John the Baptist's arrest. This doesn't sound anything like John the Baptist has been arrested here. And we saw John chapter 4, verse 1 through 4, it very much sounds like John the Baptist is still on the scene baptizing people. So, why does John 5 sound like the Baptist isn't in prison yet? Because he's not. He's not in prison yet. This is before the imprisonment. And, I mean, well, yeah. It may be very close to right here, right on the heels of John 5, is when John the Baptist is going to get arrested. But I don't think he is when Jesus is talking to the Jews after performing a miracle in Bethesda. Or Bethsaida, excuse me.
So
Yes.
I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, that this Matthew, Mark, and Luke should actually occur after John 5.
Correct.
Okay.
That is exactly correct. Yep. You are understanding it perfectly.
6, you're saying they're all come together in chapter.
And then they all meet back up in 6, which is the feeding of the 5,000. You ever wonder why you're reading the book of John? And you have here in the end of John, Jesus is in Jerusalem talking to the Jews, and he says this discourse about the fourfold witness to him, and he ends, for if you believed Moses, he's talking to the Jews in Jerusalem. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me, but if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? That's how John 5 ends. Then John 6. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. What? How'd we get there? Makes no sense unless we understand what? John's theme. It makes perfect sense. What is John 6? Feeding of 5,000, which is what? The fourth sign. Makes perfect sense. Why does he pick up with John 6? For a sign. Proving Christ's Messiah. Deity. His whole purpose. So, it feels like, let me see where I was here. Compare John 5. Yeah, here we are. Compare John 5 with Matthew 11 and Luke 7. These are where the synoptics are it's not as though the synoptics don't mention John the Baptist, but when they do, after the Galilean ministry starts, it's a different tone. It's imprisonment. It's encouragement from Jesus. It's isolation of John. That's what's going on in the synoptics with John. This feels like a totally different stage of John's life. It doesn't feel like at all like the tone of John 5. Again, John 5 seems to fit before the Baptist's arrest. And like I said here, what about John's entire purpose? The Gospel of John 20, verse 31. These have been written down so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So John's entire goal, like we've spoken about, is belief grounded in the identity of Jesus and a witness to the deity of Christ. That is his stated purpose. With this in mind, what dominates John 1 through 5? It's not parables. It's not mission trips. It's not training disciples and apostles and calling people. That's not what's dominating John 1 through 5. It's witnesses to him, who he is. It's messianic signs. All these signs are documented. It's deity discourses that's taking place. It's authority claims. Jesus is authenticating himself before he forms any formal training of the disciples. He proves who he is prior to training anyone. John meticulously records this authentication. John 5 is the climax of this, in that fourfold authentication that we'll look at. But the synoptics are recording the discipleship that takes place. The Passover problem, here we are. Here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. 8 times John the Apostle says, the Passover. The feast of the Passover. Now the Passover. It was 6 days before the Passover. How many times did I say? 8? 1, 2, 3, 4. If John mentions the Passover, if the Passover was important to John, he mentioned it as the Passover. Compare that with 5:1. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. Notice what's missing. There's no Passover language here. There's no the Passover. There's no feast of the Passover. There's no known time marker here. There's just a feast. It's completely generic. The other thing here is we can't fall into the correlation without causation problem. These two events are certainly correlated, this feast and Jesus going to Jerusalem, but Jesus leaving for Jerusalem is not necessarily caused by that feast, if that makes sense. I think that it probably was, but all it says is that there was a feast of the Jews and that Jesus went to Jerusalem. It doesn't say that because of the feast of the Jews, because of this certain feast, Jesus went to Jerusalem. Now,
As though it was one of the 3 required.
exactly, which is why I think that I'm going to tell you I think it was the Feast of Pentecost. I'm going to just say it. I'm going to get it off my chest. But did I say that already?
No, I said we're gonna write it down and send it out.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's important that when we're reading these things, we don't just immediately fall into these causation traps. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It could be Purim. Edersheim has a different feast in there, and I can't remember what it was. Like the Feast of the Wood or something, where they would give wood for the altar burning. But anyhow, it doesn't have to be one of these. It is my only point.
So would you say that between John chapter 2 and John 5, it was only about 50 days? Or do you think it was?
Yeah. I think it was probably exactly 50 days.
So Christ's ministry and his baptizing really ramped up a lot faster than we even realized.
Yep. This timeline, what I'm saying is that the Lord's ministry was rapid fire. He was on a mission. There's not a third year in here where we're like, oh, well, we'll just say that there's this other feast of the Passover in there, and, John 5 fits in there somewhere. No. Not how we should read this, I don't think. It becomes super fast. And we'll see here again, just in a moment here, why the traditional harmonies need a fourth Passover. So if John 4 and 5 are forced after the arrest and in the synoptic timeline, there's a lot of events anyways from Matthew 4 to Matthew 14, which, by the way, is after Matthew 12, which is the rejection. This is all first year. Well, that's a lot of events here. And now we're going to add all of these travels to and from, through Samaria, to Galilee and Cana, and then back to Jerusalem. We're going to heal some lame person at the pool, and then talk to this Samaritan. This is a lot of events now that we're going to have to crunch into this timeline. And this isn't like we're going to get into our car and drive up to Cana. It feels super, super cramped. It already feels cramped. So the solution was to add a year. You just add a year there. Now we can breathe a little bit. Now we have a little bit more breathing room here, because this feast is going to be the Feast of Passover, and I'm not really sure how all this fits in there, but it fits in there somewhere, and there's a whole year in there where this happened. But we should not build a chronology on what John didn't say. He didn't say this is a Feast of the Passover. And like I showed you, when he wanted it to be the Feast of the Passover, he said it. So let me show you this. The compression problem. Why a fourth Passover? If the Gospel of John 4 and 5 are forced after John's arrest and compressed into the synoptic timeline, you have to fit all of this into this short window from John's arrest to the feeding of the 5,000. You have to fit repeated travels, Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Cana to Jerusalem, Jerusalem back to Galilee. Major events have to take place here. Samaritan woman, 2 days teaching in Samaria. Nobleman's son is healed. Feast in Jerusalem. Then back to Bethesda. Then you have massive, that is in Jerusalem, excuse me. Then you have this massive leadership confrontation in Jerusalem and the John 5 discourse. This is months of activities. It's probably 2 months, to be precise. And that's before the synoptics even start. So now add everything the synoptics say happens after the arrest, before the feeding of the 5,000. And the reason I keep saying the feeding of the 5,000 is because that's when we know the second Passover is. Now, it's not as precise, but John 6 says this is around the feeding of the Passover. We know that feeding of the 5,000 happens basically right around in there somewhere. We don't know exactly, but it's around there somewhere.
Where did the feeding of the 5,000 occur?
Galilee.
That's what happened.
Yeah, so that's why it feels so strange when you read from John 5, he's in Jerusalem confronting these Jews, and he's just healed the lame man in the pool, and he's like really hot. He's confronting these guys, and then all of a sudden, and then back in Galilee by the sea, what? How do we get there? Well, it's because it's the next sign. So anyhow, so take all of those things and then add the early Galilean ministry. That includes the movement to Capernaum, calling Peter, Andrew, James, John. You call Matthew. There's this synagogue preaching circuit that takes place. There's the demons that are getting cast out. There's region-wide healings. There's the Sermon on the Mount. Multiple village tours here. You've got crowds multiplying, growing opposition. That's a lot to compress into 10 months or so. So you just add another Passover, and then it all alleviates this time. But I really think that what it does is it causes more problems than it solves. By adding that as a Passover, I think it causes more problems. So now you have John 4 and 5 events, plus all the early Galilean ministry squeezed into this short period, maybe 10 months. So why the fourth Passover? You see it now. The timeline feels so tight. It's so tight. And I'm saying this from the perspective that it's already tight. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on from from John the Baptist's arrest to the second Passover, to the feeding of the 5,000. There's a lot that happens. There's too little time for this to happen in the span of life of Christ after John's arrest and feeding of 5,000. So the system needs space. But in my opinion, the problem is by adding this Passover, you add too much space. There's a whole year here now. That's unaccounted for. What's being filled here? I don't know what's being filled here. It feels like this space because this year is highly intense with a lot going on, but that doesn't mean we need another year. The solution labeled John 5 as a Passover. But John never says it. So a cleaner solution here is what I suggest is that if the Gospel of John 4 and 5 occur before the arrest, this is the early authentication phase. This is phase 1 of his ministry, authentication. Then the arrest, then the synoptics begin a Galilean ministry. There's no compression here. There's no invented time. There's no extra Passover needed. The story breathes very naturally if we see it this way. If you put John in 4 and 5 after the arrest, you're trying to cram one and a half to 2 years of ministry into 1 year, maybe 10 months. That's why the Harmonists have to invent this other Passover. If you leave John where it naturally reads before the arrest, everything fits without forcing anything.
So my question is,
Yeah.
does that change the length of the ministry from 3.5 years to what? How long?
Yep, it does change it.
How long does it change it to?
I'd say it's 2 to 2.5 years.
So it's a whole year,
Whole year's off.
what everybody's held to?
Yep. I'd say Jesus' ministry was 2.5 years max. Max.
He died on a Pentecost,
So,
correct?
on a Passover.
On a Passover.
So why do I say that? Passover where Christ dies. Take that back to Passover of John 6. 1 year. 1 year. John 6 Passover to what? John 2 Passover, which is what? Nicodemus follows that? How many years do you have there? 2. What happens right before Passover? First Passover.
He begins his ministry.
He begins his ministry with what? First sign. First sign in Cana. Water to wine. 6 months maybe? Maybe 6 months? 2.5 years is my opinion, max. That's kind of a real fast presentation on this. And I think that I probably created more questions than I answered anything. But this, and I am all ears for other people's opinions on this. And I'm all ears for questions that you guys come up with, because y'all come up with great questions and they should be answered. But I've studied this the last couple of weeks, and I've really been trying to poke holes and figure this out. And I don't see how you put the John 4 departure as the same departure as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I don't see how you do it. It makes way more problems. Way more problems. And it confuses things. You know, you have in Fruchtenbaum's book here, he goes like section 50 is the healing of the lame person in Bethesda. Well, how'd you get there? What? That's in Jerusalem. You're plugging that into the middle of the Galilean ministry? How? You're in Jerusalem here. We know you're in Jerusalem. It doesn't make sense to me. This is something that I've always struggled with the life of Christ, because I've always read these and just sort of been like, yeah, we don't really know exactly how. And I'm not saying we know exactly how all of this played out, but I think that there's some pretty strong evidence to say that basically you pick up with Jesus's baptism, temptation, John's testimony, the calling of, and John's testimony is John 1. This is John 1, all the way through John 5. The synoptics do not start again until after John 5.
So if you took the first Passover and then the second Passover,
Mm-hmm.
can you just review for me what events occurred between the first and second Passover?
Jeez. No. That's such a good question. There's basically what's going on there is the calling of the disciples, Matthew, Peter, the rest of the 12 gets called. There's the training that takes place. There's these major preaching circuits that go around the region of Galilee. There's I believe this is when he's sending them out to preach. The formal rejection takes place. The formal rejection of Christ takes place in Galilee. They came up from Jerusalem. Why? Jesus isn't down there. He's in Galilee.
I always had it in my mind, he departed for Jerusalem relatively late in his ministry. But I'm not sure if there was more than one visit to Jerusalem. There were. So now I'm confused about that. But
Well, Jesus departs for Jerusalem. Really, I think he starts making his way there after Peter's confession. That's really when I think you see this switch that starts to take place where he starts moving towards Jerusalem for the crucifixion.
and what happened at the second Passover?
The second Passover is the feeding of the 5,000. And that's what that's the event that I'm using to date that second Passover. We don't know we can read it here, John 6. It's in that period of time. Let's see, where is it? So, it's in verse 4. So after these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. Then Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. And then he goes on to the feeding of the 5,000. So this is probably like right before the Passover, maybe. But then he goes into, the walking on water. So is that might be just before the Passover too? So it's somewhere right in there. We don't know. There's no hard marker, I don't think, that we can look at and say this is right before the second Passover. Yes.
See that John would insert that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So my own hang-up would be then this, and this is a smaller thing, but the whole saying that in John 4, in the first couple verses, that he returns again, or he went away again into Galilee, and that just sort of messes with me as far as, well then,
Okay.
then there was a time earlier, but was it earlier in his ministry or just earlier?
It was earlier in his ministry. Yeah. Go back to John chapter 1. Because that's a great catch. Let's see. So, at the end of so remember, Jesus gets baptized, goes out to the temptation, comes back, calls these four, encounters Peter. Then what does he do? Travels up to a little wedding in Cana, and that is in Galilee. So This is where the first sign takes place. And then he goes up to Capernaum for a couple of days, it says. And then in verse 12 of chapter 2. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. So they went from Cana up to Capernaum, and then they stayed there for a few days. And then in verse 13, the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. So now he's in Jerusalem.
Okay.
There's the Nicodemus, and then there's John the Baptist's witness, and then he leaves in John 4, 1 through 4, in what I'm going to call the first departure.
So Jesus would have had, after the feeding of the 5,000, and Passover was near, he would have been going back to Jerusalem.
Yep. Yeah, at some point. Some point he goes back to Jerusalem. But I don't think that's a problem because he went to Jerusalem multiple times, not just for Passover. He had to go there for Tabernacles. He had to go there for Pentecost. So just because it's not recorded here doesn't mean that he didn't move down and fulfill that obligation. So this is my what I think took place here is, this makes sense in my mind. You have John 3, Passover. You have John 4, leaves to go back up to Galilee. Goes through Samaria, heals the nobleman's son, and in Cana. Then you have him returning for the Feast of Pentecost. This is only 2 months after. Then he comes back down for the Feast of Pentecost. That's why he's in Jerusalem. Then he heals the lame man in the pool of Bethesda, or Bethsaida. It's Bethsaida, right? Bethsaida. I keep saying it wrong. He heals that lame person, confronts the Jews there. And what happens, by the way, in John 5, they're already ready to kill him. In John 5, they're already plotting to kill Christ. In John 5, this is early, guys. This is early.
And that, a 2.5-year ministry would make more sense in terms of that.
Yeah,
Would they let him go on for another year to make it a 3
that's a good point.
I mean, no, they were determined to do away with him.
They were determined. I mean, John 5 says, he heals him on the Sabbath. And then in verse 18, for this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Because he was calling God his own Father and making himself equal with God. This is the purpose of John's gospel, remember? He's the deity guy. This is
I like it.
right? He's presenting Christ's deity here. This really fits for me. I think we should see this compressed a little bit more. And I think that you have to see, so you have this take place, John 5, shortly after. I mean right after this. These are not small events. I mean, he's in the city of Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. There's thousands of people here, and he's making them mad. And the leaders are there, and they're wanting to kill him. And so then he learns, while he's down there, he learns about the arrest of John the Baptist, and he leaves. He departs to Galilee. And then, why is there never any mention of there being any training of the disciples in John 1 through 5? Because there's no training. Because there is none. He's showing himself.
If it is the Feast of Pentecost, what was the feast about? It was the Feast of First Fruits. It was like the the promise of Benny to come, or the crop to come. It was the harvest of the first wave of wheat that was planted, and there was promise that it was, the Pentecost was looking forward to the fulfillment of the whole harvest later in the year. So if it is the feast of Pentecost, I'm just
Yeah.
theorizing, then here is Christ the first fruits early in the ministry, and it would be a rejection of that concept right off the bat.
Right off the bat, yeah. Yeah, I think that the Lord has been authenticating himself early. He's authenticated himself very early in his ministry, and the rejection of Christ by the leadership it came early. They wanted to kill him. They rejected him way early. Before he even, why does Jesus need to go? Why does he go make disciples? Why? He's the king.
Well, he's prepping up for the book of Acts.
Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, why has he even got to go make disciples? He's the king here. He's the Messiah. He's the God-man. I've proved it to you. I've shown you. Here's my fourfold witness. Oh, you want to kill me? You've rejected it? Okay. I'm going to go make some disciples, and we're going to do this another way.
Well, another point of making disciples is to have a record, to have people there that can actually scribe it, and so that we know about it.
That's interesting, because I think that's so interesting, because if that's true, which I like, there's no documentation of these disciples about these other events that took place. If that's their purpose of writing these things down, documenting them, and recording it, why didn't they do it? Why didn't Luke? Luke is who we go to for chronology, and I'm not trying to equate chronology with exhaustive record, right? I'm not trying to say that Luke documented every little thing that happened. Oh, man. But if Luke is the one that we go to that go, oh, he's the chronological guy, and then you're going to say John 4 and 5 happened in the synoptic timeline, I would think Luke might have documented the healing of the lame man, and I think Luke might have had something to say about why Peter was like down in Samaria, and then they come walking up and they see Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman. Well, Peter's not there. They're not there. They don't have firsthand knowledge of this. Anyways, that's a lot to chew on for a little bit. But I think really, I do. If we see this timeline, it makes more sense to me. It makes a lot more sense to me. So think about that and